I'm going to go ahead and get started. I do want to thank everybody for joining today. There are pretty substantial changes to the rules, so we just wanted to make sure that we were able to give you at least a general overview. Just a reminder that the summary is not exhaustive, and it's not a substitute for reading the regulations. Please make sure you spend some time going through them very carefully, and don't hesitate to reach out. So just an overall summary of what I'm going to cover in this session. Number one is this is the first time that the rules have been updated since they were first established in 2015 when the dispensary licensing program was first stood up. So there have been a lot of legislative and statutory changes. So we went through it and made sure that all of those changes were implemented. Other than that, there are other things that we do want to work on and we intend to work on. However, our primary focus in this revision was to ensure that there were standards in place to allow the licensees to begin to produce edible cannabis product types that were authorized by the legislature. And ensure that there are additional safety requirements for all products. I would say that when the program was first established back in 2015, there was a lot of focus, obviously typical of other states' cannabis programs, so a lot of focus primarily on security concerns. And there was not a lot of attention given to public health and product safety concerns. And so we wanted to update those parts of the rules. Along with safety comes packaging and labeling requirements, so that those have been updated. And then with regards to lab testing, we wanted to clarify the requirements for sampling for testing. And then also updating some of the testing requirements themselves, because a lot has changed since 2015. And then, now that the Farm Bill has passed since 2015, and there's availability of hemp, and the Food and Drug Branch has stood up its hemp processing rules. We wanted to clarify where there may be an intersection between the medical cannabis program and hemp processing. So first off, the statutory changes. Okay, I'm not going to go into a lot of details in this. Like I said, there were a lot, but just to touch on them quickly, the legislature did specify a change in use of terminology from marijuana to cannabis. So we went through and made all of those changes. You are all aware that the state now allows out-of-state patients, visitors, to obtain a visitor card. So we had to go through and make those changes. We also updated a bunch of definitions related to the facility, a subcontractor. And then there were a bunch of flexibilities that were added to allow the department to consider the number of licenses to issue per county, the number of production centers per licensee, number of plants that each production center can house, and the number of retail dispensing locations per licensee. In addition, there was an added procedure to allow for the change of the individual licensee. And I think a couple of dispensaries have made use of this new procedure so far. We did allow for it, even though it wasn't in the rules yet. Removal of public housing complexes from the restriction on locations of dispensary facilities. And then clarification of who's subject to background checks. And then some conditions for denying employment, where it was changed from restrictive to permissive language. The dispensary licensees may recall that, you know, we had to add a little different checkbox to that letter that we send you about whether an individual cleared the background check requirements, just because there are still restrictions on the amount of information that we can share regarding a person's background history. So the language is basically that, you know, it's permissive. You can hire the person, and it's sort of to give some indication that there may be some background history that, you know, that your particular company may want to discuss with the applicant. The Office of Medical Cannabis Control and Regulation was established and stood up, and clarifying who's allowed to have cannabis within the dispensaries and facilities, opening up the dispensing hours, allowing retail stores to be open on Sundays and holidays. And then there were the added product types, safe pulmonary administration, which are, you know, the spa cartridges. It's just a naming convention, you know, not allowing them to be called vape cartridges because of the department's very strong stance against smoking and vaping. The use of transdermal production of transdermal patches, and then, as I mentioned earlier, lastly, edible cannabis products. Clarification over the allowance for inter-island transport for the purpose of testing, lab testing, and then clarification that license renewal related inspections are unannounced. And then there was a reduction of the retention time for security for footage storage. There were requirements to implement procedures in event of tracking system malfunctions. There was an allowance for reprocessing of limited reprocessing of products that may have failed for certain lab analytes. New packaging changes that increased the total amount of THC that was allowed in a package, and then clarification that cannabis products need to be packaged at their point of manufacture. Additional labeling requirements, keep out of reach of children, and that this product is a medication that contains cannabis and not a food. As I mentioned before, one of our priorities was to ensure that edible cannabis products could be produced. So one of the things that we had to look at was the statutory definition of edible cannabis products in 329D. States that edible cannabis products means manufactured cannabis products that are intended for gastrointestinal administration of any cannabinoid extracted from the cannabis plant. And as a result of this, we realized that this statutory definition does apply to a number of the existing product types that are already being manufactured. So these product types, the capsules, lozenges, pills, tinctures, essentially things that are going to go into a patient's mouth, are being recategorized as edible cannabis products. And in addition to that, the rules will be allowing for a select number of product types. We are starting on a more limited basis, but we do think that it's still quite a bit of a good variety of product types. So what will be explicitly allowed under the new rules are production of gummies, okay, hard molded confections made primarily of sugar or syrup. This is another naming convention similar to the spa cartridges. We are not allowing the use of the term candy. But essentially this describes a candy product like a cough drop or something like that. You know, it's a hard candy. Chocolates, cookies, brownies, infused honey, beverages, powdered beverage mixes or beverage additives, and then syrups or liquid beverage mixes and beverage additives. So edible cannabis products, these are the safety measures that are specific for edible cannabis products. So they cannot be a product that requires what is called time temperature controlled for safety. And this is determined by the water activity and the pH, or in the alternative, by doing what's called a product assessment, which is basically going through a fairly detailed assessment of the product to demonstrate that the product does not require time or temperature control for safety. Essentially what these are shelf-stable products. The products must be homogeneous in cannabinoid content. There's new language restricting the appeal to minors. This information, some of the new requirements came from, there was a work group, I think it was in 2019, a legislative work group specifically on edible products. And this was one of the recommendations that came out of that legislative work group. And so the form of the product cannot be designed to resemble candy or any other products that are marketed to minors. It cannot be in the shape of or contain a depiction of a human or animal or fruit. And you cannot, as I mentioned earlier, use the word candy or candies in packaging, labeling, or on your menus. And that would include the menu, your online menus for your dispensaries. Although infused oils and butters are allowed, there is a prohibition against the use of garlic and peppers because this has been identified to be a risk for botulism. And then tinctures are now going to be restricted to a 2-ounce maximum package size, and it must be labeled for use in drops or dropperfuls. Okay. Also, with regards specifically to edible cannabis products, packaging and labeling requirements. So there must be packaging that has some form of a portion, and this is to ensure that the patient user can clearly understand what is considered to be a single serving or single dose. So these 3 bullets are ors. In other words, you have to choose one of the options. You don't have to do all of them, obviously. So you can choose to make the products in single service packages, or the product can have scoring or guides on it that help to break the product into single serving portions, or the product can include a measuring device that is specifically designed or sized or marked to clearly measure a single serving. Labeling must also specify the serving size and also specify the cannabinoid content of a serving. And that would include the required cannabinoids that are specified for testing. But if you choose to highlight any other type of cannabinoid that may be present in the product, or that, and it's specifically listed or described on the label or the packaging, then you must include information regarding the amount of that cannabinoid on the labeling. And there is a new requirement for an allergen statement. Okay, so product safety requirements, and these apply to all products. So even for the the topicals and for non-manufactured products. So it applies to flower material as well. And the reason for these, as I mentioned earlier, is that the initial rules, a lot of attention was focused on more on security. And these are some basic product safety requirements that we have added. Okay. So the first thing is that for cannabis flower, it cannot have any added ingredients. I'm not saying that this was a concern in Hawaii, but this has been a concern nationally with other programs about cannabis flower being dusted or treated with other compounds. And we wanted to make sure, so other states as well have moved towards disallowing this. There are a number of banned components and ingredients in manufactured cannabis products, and these are also basic product safety requirements. So these include items, components and ingredients that are on the FDA Food and Cosmetics banned lists, psychoactive ingredients that are not derived from cannabis, and any ingredients that may increase the potency, toxicity, or addictive potential of the product, or create a potentially unsafe combination with cannabinoids. So we are talking about things like added nicotine or added caffeine and those sorts of things, as well as other compounds that might have this effect. We are also banning the use of cannabinoids that are created through isomerization and the use of synthetic cannabinoids. Other basic product safety requirements for solvents and processing methods, you must use food grade solvents in your processing. And we are banning certain solvents that are classified by the U.S. Pharmacopoeia as class 1 because they have unacceptable toxicity levels or have been found to have deleterious environmental effects. We are also banning open butane processing. Closed system processing is allowed, but any open processing is disallowed. And then also any other method that the department should determine is a potential risk. And then there's an explicit ban on sales to minors and qualifying patients, minor qualifying patients and out-of-state qualifying patients. Essentially what this is that the sales transaction must happen with the minor patient's caregiver. And then there is a requirement for reserve samples that I will go over later in this presentation. Okay, so a lot of the product safety requirements that have been added, there are good manufacturing practices, and there are additional quality control and record keeping requirements. The next two slides are going to cover some of the requirements in a little bit more detail, primarily to try to distinguish between those requirements that are going to become effective when the rules become effective, and then those that are being delayed. And the reason for this is that we understand that some of the requirements are going to take some time for licensees to implement. And so we wanted to make sure that we didn't drop requirements that would be impossible for licensees to implement on day one. Okay, so these GMPs and quality control and record keeping requirements the ones that are effective immediately there are ones that are effective immediately for products that are currently being produced and dispensed. And these mostly replace, the ones that are required are ones that mostly replace what was Section 75 in the existing rules. And then there are ones that will be effective immediately for any new product that a licensee would like to produce. And then, as I mentioned, for existing products, there are certain requirements that will not become effective until January 1st of 2023. Okay. So the requirements that have the little asterisk at the end, those are the ones that are immediately in effect for products that are already being produced, in order to continue to produce them. But these are requirements that, the personnel are, the rules that were, the sections that were already in Section 75, that you can't have sick personnel or people with open cuts and sores, that the facility and grounds must be, kept upkept, and that they're, the operation must have basic sanitary requirements and controls. The new things that have been added that there's a delayed implementation on are requirements for cleaning and sanitation of equipment and utensils, processing and controls, and warehousing and distribution. So requirements about the way that products are stored and distributed. Okay. These are all new requirements. That you're going to be required to maintain SOPs, batch production and distribution records for manufactured products, conduct quality control review, and when there's anomaly, make a disposition decision and document those decisions. Have protocols for returned cannabis or manufactured products, have protocols to deal with product complaints, have protocols for dealing with adverse events, have protocols for doing product recalls, and have record keeping related to quality control of products. The only one that is going to be required immediately upon the rules becoming effective is the requirement for reporting of adverse events to the Department of Health. The other requirements, as I mentioned before, do not become effective until January 1st of 2023. Packaging and labeling. So the dosage limits, the package limit, it is total THC. It's not just Delta-9 THC, but it is the 10 milligrams per serving and 1,000 milligrams per package. So total THC is defined. But basically it's the sum of the percentage by weight of THCA with a factor involved for decarboxylating, and then the decarboxylated form, and then also any Delta-8 or Delta-10. The reason for clarifying this is the intent of the THC limit is to be able to provide consumers with information on the total potential properties of the product that they are consuming. And so this is the reason why we wanted to make sure it was clarified. Labeling. And so it's basically that the labeling has to have the total THC, the Delta-9, CBD, and as I mentioned earlier, any other cannabinoid that's specifically listed or described in the label or packaging. There is a requirement for an ingredient statement. Ingredients are those compounds that remain in the final finished product. And then for topical products, it must contain the words for external use only. There's a new readability requirement. Letters or numbers must be at least 1/16 inch in height, and required information has to be placed prominently. It's just making sure that the placement and the way that the required content is placed is going to support the user actually reading and the information. Okay, sampling requirements. Okay, so we have added definitions related to batch, final form, because our rules require that it's final product testing, what a representative sample is, and then also the requirement for reserve samples. So the things that we're trying to clarify, as I mentioned, is what is representative in the sample that's taken from a batch. And, you know, with regards to final form, clarification that as to when that sample must be taken. And that it has to, you know, the sample has to be sufficient to do all the required testing. And it must be statistically valid. Okay, so clarification on what's meant by reserve samples. Licensees are going to be required to maintain 2 reserve samples from each batch of product. And the reserve samples should be held in the same packaging in which the product is dispensed, and under conditions that are consistent with the labeling of the product. And they must be held for 1 year past the use by date. And this is to allow for collection of those samples and doing supplemental testing should there be any concerns that are raised with regards to that product. And it's also for doing supplemental studies such as shelf stability on various types of products. And the reserve samples you're required to make them available for analysis, or if we ask you to have them analyzed, then you must have them available for testing. Okay, lab testing. So we've somewhat reorganized or clarified what the testing requirements are. So as we've mentioned, total THC testing, Delta 9 specifically, CBD, and any other cannabinoid that's listed on the product. For the other contaminants, there are no changes to the requirements for heavy metals testing. The pesticides on the new rules, you'll notice that we now have a table that lists all the pesticides that are tested for. It's basically codifying what the current requirements are. Solvents, you will see that there is a much more comprehensive list. We took the list largely from the California requirements. However, we did also add those USP Class 1 solvents that I mentioned earlier. The concentration limits were changed for butane, hexane, toluene, heptane, and xylenes. Benzene is remaining the same. Additionally, on the contaminants, we've made a decision to focus on microbial contaminants that are of public health concern. And as a result, we have removed the requirement for total viable aerobic bacteria, total yeast and mold, total coliforms, biotolerant gram-negative testing. We have added a specific requirement for Aspergillus terreus, And we changed the terminology from 1 CFU per gram to not detected in 1 gram. And this allows for non-plating testing methods. Mycotoxins were separated into 2 groups to specify which are aflatoxins and which are, and then separated from ochratoxin. Water activity now replaces moisture content, and for flour material, there's a requirement that it be less than under 0.65. Okay, with regards to hemp, we have made a decision to disallow hemp production or processing within medical cannabis production centers. So dispensary licensees, medical cannabis dispensary licensees may also register to be hemp processor, but the hemp processing must be done in a separate facility. However, we do understand that there is a desire to be able to use hemp-derived products. And so dispensary licensees may retail Chapter 1137, which is the hemp processing, hemp product rules under the Food and Drug Branch. If a product is determined to be compliant with those rules, you may take those products and you may sell them in your dispensary retail location. And in addition, hemp products that are compliant with 1137 may be used as an ingredient in a manufactured cannabis product. And then again, just a really quick reminder, you must read the rules. You know, and if you have any questions, we are available